The October morning arrived cold and merciless at Fort Carson, Colorado. Frost clung to the training field grass like scattered diamonds, each blade rigid under the weight of temperatures that had plummeted overnight into the low 30s. The sun had barely cleared the eastern peaks of the Rockies, casting long shadows across the sprawling military installation that stretched for miles against the foothills. In the pale dawn light, nearly 200 soldiers assembled in precise formation, their breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the thin mountain air. The sound of boots crunching on frost-covered ground filled the silence as personnel from various units converged on the designated assessment area. This was the quarterly physical training evaluation, a ritual as old as military service itself. Every soldier present knew the routine by heart: push-ups, sit-ups, the 2-mile run, and the obstacle course. It was a test they had passed dozens of times before, a familiar challenge that separated those who maintained standards from those who allowed comfort to erode discipline. At the front of the formation stood Colonel Marcus Harlow, an imposing figure whose 6'3" frame seemed to command attention through sheer presence alone. At 52 years old, he carried himself with the rigid bearing of a man who had built his entire career on the foundation of physical excellence and unwavering discipline. His uniform was pressed to perfection, each crease sharp enough to draw blood. The silver eagles on his shoulders gleamed in the morning light, catching the sun with every slight movement. His face was weathered from 3 decades of service, lined with the kind of permanent severity that came from years of demanding perfection from everyone around him. Harlow's gray eyes swept across the assembled soldiers with the cold assessment of a man who had seen countless recruits come and go, who had watched standards slowly erode over his long career, and who believed that physical fitness was the cornerstone upon which all military readiness was built. To him, this quarterly assessment was not merely a bureaucratic requirement. It was a statement of values, a demonstration of commitment, a line drawn in the sand between those who truly understood what it meant to serve and those who were simply going through the motions. Among the sea of uniforms stood Corporal Ainsley Thorne. At 5 feet 2 inches tall and barely 120 pounds, she seemed almost lost among the towering figures surrounding her. Her frame was slight, almost delicate in appearance, the kind of build that prompted assumptions about capability and strength. Her auburn hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, not a single strand out of place, despite the wind that had picked up as the sun rose higher. Her hazel eyes held a quiet intensity that most people missed on first glance, a depth of focus that spoke to experiences far beyond what her youthful appearance might suggest. To her fellow soldiers, Ainsley was simply another administrative clerk, one of the countless personnel who kept the massive military machine running smoothly from behind desks and computer screens. For the past 8 months since her transfer to Fort Carson, she had maintained a low profile, performed her supply clerk duties with quiet efficiency, and rarely engaged in the casual conversations that filled break rooms and dining facilities. Some thought her antisocial. Others assumed she was simply charmant. None of them knew the truth that lived beneath her uniform, hidden behind the carefully constructed cover story that had brought her to this unremarkable assignment. As Colonel Harlow began his pre-assessment address, his voice carried across the field with the kind of commanding authority that came naturally to men of his rank and temperament. Listen up, soldiers. Today's assessment will determine your fitness for duty, your readiness for deployment, and your commitment to the standards that separate us from civilians. There are no excuses here, no exceptions, no shortcuts. Every one of you will complete this assessment to the best of your ability, because that is what real soldiers do. That is what service to this nation demands. The words echoed across the field, each syllable crisp and clear in the cold morning air. Around Ainsley, soldiers straightened their posture, faces set with determination or resignation, depending on their individual levels of preparation. She felt the familiar tightness beginning to build in her chest, a subtle constriction that started along her left side and gradually spread outward like ripples on water. The sensation was as familiar as breathing now, a constant companion that she had learned to manage but never fully ignore. Harlow continued, warming to his theme, as he always did when addressing matters of physical standards and military readiness. I see some of you standing here already making calculations about how you can just barely pass, how you can do the minimum required and call it good enough. Let me be crystal clear. Minimum standards are exactly that. Minimum. They represent the floor, not the ceiling. Real soldiers, warriors, who understand what this profession demands, they don't aim for minimums. They push themselves beyond what they thought possible. They embrace discomfort. They turn challenge into opportunity. Ainsley adjusted her stance slightly unconsciously, compensating for the persistent ache that had taken up permanent residence along her ribs. The movement was subtle, practiced the kind of minor adjustment that her body made automatically now, without conscious thought. She had become an expert at functioning despite discomfort, at maintaining composure while managing pain that would have sent most people to seek medical attention. First event, Harlow announced, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. Push-ups. You have 2 minutes to complete as many repetitions as possible. Standard form. Full range of motion. No modifications. No excuses. Take your positions. The soldiers spread out across the designated area, each finding their spot on the marked ground. The familiar rhythm of military fitness testing began with NCOs calling out instructions and maintaining the precise cadence that had been drilled into them through years of repetition. Ainsley moved with the group, but as she knelt down to assume the starting position, the tightness in her chest intensified noticeably. She placed her hands on the cold ground, feeling the frost crunch beneath her palms. The temperature of the earth seemed to seep through her uniform, but it was not the cold that caused her to hesitate. As she lowered herself into the first repetition, a sharp pain shot through her left side, radiating from deep within the tissue that had been torn and rebuilt, protesting against the movement with familiar vehemence. The pulling sensation was intense, as if invisible hands were tugging at muscles and scar tissue that had never quite healed properly. Ainsley pushed through the discomfort, completing the first push-up with controlled precision, then the second, then the third. Each repetition sent waves of pain coursing through her torso, but her face remained neutral, betraying nothing of the internal struggle. Years of training and experience had taught her how to compartmentalize physical discomfort, how to continue functioning when every nerve ending screamed for her to stop. By the 15th repetition, sweat had begun to bead on her forehead despite the cold morning air. It was not the sweat of exertion that came from muscles working hard. It was the cold sweat that accompanied the body's response to trauma, to pain signals being systematically ignored and overridden through sheer force of will. The burning sensation in her side had transformed from sharp protest to deep grinding ache that seemed to radiate from her very core. 20 push-ups, 21, 22. Each movement became progressively more difficult, not from muscle fatigue, but from the way damaged tissue responded to stress it was never meant to endure again. At 25 repetitions, the pulling sensation reached a threshold that Ainsley recognized immediately. This was the line she had learned not to cross during months of physical therapy and rehabilitation. This was where further damage would occur if she continued. Slowly, deliberately, she rose from the push-up position and stepped back from the formation. The movement was careful and controlled, revealing none of the internal calculation that had led to the decision. Several soldiers glanced in her direction, their expressions ranging from curiosity to mild judgment, but she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead as she approached the edge of the testing area where Colonel Harlow stood observing the proceedings. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the discomfort coursing through her body, "I need to request an exemption from the fitness assessment. I have some old injuries that are acting up today." Colonel Harlow turned toward her, his expression shifting from professional attention to barely concealed irritation. His gray eyes narrowed as he looked down at the small woman before him, taking in her slight build and what he perceived as a fundamental lack of the robust physicality he expected from every soldier under his command. In his mind, military service was about overcoming obstacles, pushing through discomfort, and proving oneself worthy of the uniform. What he saw before him was someone looking for an easy way out. "Old injuries," Harlow repeated, his tone carrying a note of skepticism that was unmistakable to everyone within hearing distance. The way he said the words made them sound like an accusation rather than a statement. "Soldier, you look like you have barely seen a day of real military service, let alone sustained any injuries worth mentioning. What exactly are we talking about here? A twisted ankle from stepping off a curb, a paper cut from filing too many reports." The comment drew a few nervous chuckles from nearby soldiers, the kind of uncomfortable laughter that accompanied moments when authority figures made jokes at someone else's expense. Ainsley felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up her neck, but she maintained her composure, her expression remaining neutral, even as Colonel Harlow continued his assessment. "Let me guess," Harlow said, his voice gaining volume as he sensed what he perceived as weakness before him. "You have been sitting behind a desk for so long that the thought of actual physical exertion has you looking for excuses? You figured you could just show up, go through the motions, and when things got a little uncomfortable, you would find a way to opt out. Am I getting warm here, Corporal?" More soldiers had stopped their own exercises to listen now, creating an impromptu audience for what was becoming less of a conversation and more of a public correction. Harlow seemed to relish the attention, his chest expanding slightly as he continued his critique of the small woman standing before him. "You know what your problem is, Thorne?" Harlow's voice carried across the field, ensuring that his words reached every person present. "You have forgotten what it means to be a soldier. You have gotten comfortable. You think that because you push papers instead of pushing your limits, you can just check out whenever things get a little bit hard. Well, that is not how it works in my command. Every soldier, regardless of their job specialty, maintains the same standards of physical fitness and mental toughness." Ainsley stood perfectly still during the colonel's tirade, her hazel eyes fixed on a point just over his left shoulder. Her breathing remained controlled, and even a technique she had learned during months of rehabilitation and therapy sessions designed to help her manage not just physical pain, but the psychological aftermath of trauma. The tightness in her chest had not subsided. If anything, the stress of the situation was making it worse. But she had long ago mastered the art of functioning despite physical discomfort that would have overwhelmed most people. "I have seen your type before." Harlow continued his momentum building as he constructed what he clearly intended to be a definitive statement about standards and commitment. Administrative clerks who joined the military, thinking it was going to be like a civilian job with better benefits. You probably thought you could skate by on minimum requirements, never really challenged, never really tested. Well, today you are going to learn what it means to be a real soldier. You are going to complete this assessment like everyone else, and you are going to do it without whining about imaginary injuries. The words imaginary injuries hung in the air like a challenge, creating a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch far longer than the few seconds it actually lasted. Around the training field, soldiers had stopped what they were doing entirely to watch the confrontation unfold. Some wore expressions of sympathy for Ainsley, uncomfortable with the public nature of the correction. Others seemed to agree with the colonel's assessment, nodding slightly as if his words confirmed their own suspicions. But all of them were waiting to see how the situation would resolve itself. The morning sun had climbed higher now, burning off some of the frost and casting shorter shadows across the field. Birds continued their songs in the trees that bordered the training area, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. The temperature was rising with the sun, but the cold that had settled over the assembled soldiers had nothing to do with weather. Ainsley stood motionless for several long moments after Colonel Harlow finished speaking. Her face remained impassive, revealing nothing of the calculations taking place behind her calm exterior. She could have explained. She could have provided context that would have immediately changed the tone of the conversation and transformed Harlow's mockery into something else entirely. But years of training and bitter experience had taught her that sometimes the most powerful response was silence, accompanied by action rather than words. Finally, without saying anything, Ainsley reached up and grasped the zipper of her military-issued jacket. The movement was slow and deliberate, her fingers working with practiced precision despite a slight tremor that had developed in her hands. The sound of the zipper seemed impossibly loud in the silence that had fallen over the training field, a metallic whisper that drew every eye to her small frame, standing before the towering colonel. As the jacket opened, revealing the olive-drab t-shirt underneath, Ainsley began to shrug out of the outer garment. Her movements were careful and controlled, betraying none of the discomfort that the motion caused her. The jacket fell away from her shoulders, and she folded it neatly before setting it on the ground beside her feet with the same precise attention to detail that characterized everything she did. What happened next would be seared into the memory of every person present for the rest of their lives. With the same deliberate care she had shown in removing her jacket, Ainsley grasped the hem of her t-shirt and began to lift it over her head. The fabric rose slowly, revealing first her abdomen, then her ribs, and finally her back as she turned slightly to ensure that everyone present could see what she was about to show them. The movement was not dramatic or theatrical. It was simply purposeful, the actions of someone who had made a decision and was seeing it through with absolute commitment. The first gasp came from somewhere in the crowd of watching soldiers, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to break the spell of silence that had fallen over the training field. Then another gasp, and another, until the morning air was filled with the collective sound of nearly 200 people confronting something they had never expected to witness. Ainsley's back and the left side of her rib cage were covered in scars. But these were not the thin, neat lines that might result from surgical procedures or minor injuries. These were the deep, jagged, irregular marks left by high-velocity shrapnel when explosive devices sent metal fragments through human flesh at tremendous speeds. The scars formed a constellation of trauma across her pale skin, some as thick as pencils, others branching like lightning strikes frozen in time. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who had seen combat casualties or studied injury reports from modern warfare. The scarring covered an area roughly the size of a dinner plate extending from just below her left shoulder blade down to her waist and wrapping around her side to disappear beneath her remaining clothing. The scars varied in color and texture, some still bearing the reddish hue of relatively recent healing, others having faded to the silvery white of older trauma. But what shocked the assembled soldiers into stunned silence was not just the presence of the scars themselves. It was their specific pattern and distribution. To the trained eye, to anyone who had studied casualty reports and medical assessments from recent combat operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, these were not random injuries. They were the signature wounds of a very specific type of incident, the kind of trauma pattern that appeared in classified after-action reports and closed-door briefings about missions that officially never happened, the kind of wounds that told a story of survival against odds that should have been insurmountable. Colonel Marcus Harlow felt the blood drain from his face as he stared at the evidence before him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. In his 30 years of military service, he had seen plenty of combat injuries. He had visited wounded soldiers in military hospitals, had read countless medical reports, had attended memorial services for those who did not survive their encounters with modern warfare. He knew exactly what he was looking at, and more importantly, he understood what it meant. The scars on Ainsley's back matched injury patterns he had seen in classified briefings. Suddenly, with terrible clarity, a specific meeting from 18 months earlier rushed back into his consciousness. Spring of 2023, a closed-door session at division headquarters, a briefing about Operation Steel Guardian, a mission that had taken place in the mountain regions of Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The official reports had classified the operation as having no personnel casualties, a designation that technically referred only to fatalities, but which had become the accepted shorthand for describing outcomes. But Harlow had been present for the actual briefing, the one where senior officers with appropriate clearances discussed what really happened during missions that the public would never know about. He remembered the briefing officer's careful language describing injuries that were serious but not fatal. He remembered the clinical description of shrapnel wounds sustained by one team member when an improvised explosive device had detonated during the team's extraction phase. He remembered the specific terminology used to describe the characteristic scatter pattern of metal fragments that had penetrated protective gear and inflicted massive tissue damage. As Harlow continued to stare at Ainsley's scars, fragments of that briefing echoed in his memory with devastating clarity. The briefing officer had described the injury pattern in precise medical terms, the characteristic distribution of shrapnel across the subject's back and side, the penetration depth that had required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation, the tissue damage that would prevent the individual from returning to combat operations but would not necessarily end their military career entirely. The pattern was identical. The distribution of injuries matched exactly what he had heard described in that classified session. But that was impossible because, according to every official document he had access to, Operation Steel Guardian had resulted in no personnel casualties. The soldier who had been wounded in that operation, the communications specialist who had sustained those devastating injuries, was supposed to be safely hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and official secrecy. They were not supposed to be standing in front of him on a training field at Fort Carson, forced to reveal their identity to 200 witnesses because of his arrogant assumptions. The silence on the training field stretched unbroken only by the distant sound of vehicles moving on nearby roads and the continued songs of birds that remained unaware of the human drama unfolding below them. Nearly 200 soldiers stood transfixed, their morning routine completely forgotten as they processed what they were witnessing. The more experienced personnel, particularly the NCOs and officers who had served in combat roles, began to recognize the significance of what they were seeing. Sergeant First Class Rita Calloway, a 20-year veteran who had served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, felt her throat tighten as she stared at Ainsley's back. Calloway had seen similar injuries before, had visited wounded comrades in military hospitals, and had attended too many memorial services for those who had not survived their encounters with improvised explosive devices. She knew that wounds like these came with stories, with experiences that changed people in ways that never fully healed, that left scars on the soul that were deeper and more permanent than anything visible on the skin. The realization began to spread through the assembled soldiers like ripples on water, each person processing the implications of what they were seeing and reaching their own conclusions about what it meant. Whispered conversations began to emerge from the silence, fragments of questions and observations that reflected the growing understanding that they were in the presence of someone whose military service had included experiences most of them could barely imagine. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered from the back of the formation, their voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Those are shrapnel scars." "IED pattern." Another voice added, this one belonging to a staff sergeant who had served as a combat medic during his previous deployment. "Multiple entry points, deep penetration." "How is she even standing up straight?" "She must have been right on top of it when it went off," said a young private who had never seen combat injuries up close before. The awe in his voice was unmistakable. The questions and observations continued to ripple through the crowd, all spoken in hushed tones, as if the soldiers instinctively understood that they were witnessing something that demanded respect and reverence. The casual atmosphere that had characterized the beginning of the morning's events had evaporated completely, replaced by a solemn recognition of truths about courage and sacrifice that went far deeper than any fitness assessment could measure. Ainsley stood motionless throughout the soldiers' reactions, her t-shirt still bunched in her hands and her back still exposed to the morning air. The cold was beginning to affect her, now goosebumps rising on her pale skin, but she made no move to cover herself. Her expression remained neutral, almost serene, as if she had found a kind of peace in finally showing the truth that she had carried hidden beneath her uniform for the past 8 months. The pain in her left side had not subsided. If anything, the cold air was making it worse, the temperature causing muscles and damaged tissue to tighten and protest. But she had learned long ago to function despite discomfort that would have been incapacitating to most people. The scars themselves were not painful in the traditional sense. They were primarily areas of reduced sensation where nerve damage had occurred during the initial injury and subsequent surgeries. But the underlying muscle and tissue damage continued to create problems that physical therapy and medical intervention had only partially resolved. Colonel Harlow continued to stare at the evidence before him, his mind racing as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. If these were indeed injuries from Operation Steel Guardian, if Ainsley had been present during that mission, then everything about her current assignment and her apparent role as an administrative clerk was a carefully constructed cover story. Special operations personnel who were medically retired from active combat roles, but who remained fit for administrative duty, were often placed in positions that appeared routine to outside observers. Their real identities and service histories were classified, protected by layers of bureaucracy and official secrecy designed to shield both the individuals and the sensitive operations in which they had participated. The more Harlow considered the implications, the more certain he became that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. If Ainsley was indeed a veteran of classified operations, if her injuries were the result of combat service at the highest levels of military engagement, then his public humiliation of her represented not just a failure of leadership, but a potentially serious breach of security protocols. Special operations veterans with classified backgrounds were supposed to be protected from exactly this kind of exposure. Their cover identities were meant to shield them from unwanted attention and allow them to transition to administrative roles without having to explain or justify their past service. By forcing Ainsley to reveal her scars, Harlow had potentially compromised operational security and violated numerous regulations regarding the treatment of personnel with classified service histories. The weight of his mistake began to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. His face had gone pale, and a slight tremor had developed in his hands as he continued to stare at the evidence of his error. Around him, the soldiers who had witnessed his earlier mockery were beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just occurred, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern to barely concealed anger at their commanding officer's behavior. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, Ainsley slowly began to lower her t-shirt back into place. The movement was careful and deliberate, her hands steady despite the cold and the intensity of nearly 200 pairs of eyes focused on her. As the fabric settled back over her scars, hiding them once again from view, she bent down and retrieved her jacket from the ground where she had carefully placed it. The simple act of putting her jacket back on seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the training field. Soldiers began to shift and move the rigid attention that had characterized their observation of the previous few minutes, giving way to restless energy that accompanied moments of high tension. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, subdued and respectful rather than casual and joking. The morning's scheduled activities had been completely derailed, and it was clear that no one had the heart to continue with routine exercises after what they had just witnessed. "Sir," Ainsley said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the relative silence. Her tone was calm and professional, betraying none of the emotions that might have been expected from someone who had just been publicly humiliated and forced to reveal deeply personal trauma. "I will be returning to my duties now if there is nothing else you need from me." The statement was technically a request for permission, but it carried the weight of someone who had just demonstrated that they were operating under entirely different circumstances than anyone had previously understood. It was not the voice of a subordinate seeking approval. It was the voice of someone who had earned the right to make their own decisions about what she would and would not endure. Colonel Harlow opened his mouth to respond, but found that words failed him completely. His throat felt dry, and his usual commanding presence seemed to have deserted him entirely. He was acutely aware that every person present was watching his reaction, waiting to see how he would handle the situation that his own actions had created. The authority and confidence that had characterized his earlier speech had evaporated, leaving behind only the uncomfortable awareness that he had judged someone based on incomplete information and arrogant assumptions. Before he could formulate any kind of response, Ainsley turned and began walking away from the training area. Her stride was measured and purposeful, betraying none of the discomfort that Harlow now realized she had been managing throughout their entire interaction. She moved with quiet confidence, the kind that came from having faced far greater challenges than a fitness test and survived to carry the evidence on her skin. As she walked away, the soldiers who had been participating in the assessment began to disperse as well, the morning's scheduled activities forgotten in the wake of what they had witnessed. The story of what had happened during the fitness assessment began to spread throughout Fort Carson with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. By 1100 hours, less than 3 hours after the incident on the training field, nearly everyone on the base had heard some version of the events. The details varied significantly depending on the source and the number of people through whom the information had passed, but certain core elements remained consistent across all tellings. A small female soldier had been publicly challenged by a senior officer. Her response had been to reveal scars that spoke to combat experience far beyond what anyone had suspected. The colonel who had mocked her had been left speechless, his assumptions shattered by visual evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. These were the facts that everyone agreed upon, and they were enough to ensure that the incident would be discussed in dining facilities, barracks, and break rooms across the installation for weeks to come. By 1400 hours, the story had begun to leak beyond the confines of Fort Carson itself. Soldiers with social media accounts posted carefully worded messages that avoided specific details but hinted at something significant having occurred. "Witnessed something today that changed my perspective on courage," read one tweet. "Sometimes the quietest people have the loudest stories to tell," read another. The posts were vague enough to avoid violating security protocols, but they caught the attention of military bloggers and journalists who specialized in covering stories from the armed forces. By 1800 hours, a reporter from the Colorado Springs Gazette, who maintained contacts throughout the military community, had begun making inquiries to the Fort Carson Public Affairs Office. The questions were general at first, asking about any unusual incidents during the morning's training activities. But they became more specific as the reporter's sources provided additional details about what had transpired. The base PAO found themselves scrambling to develop a response strategy for a story they had not anticipated and did not fully understand. Meanwhile, Ainsley Thorne sat in her small office in the administrative building, trying to focus on the routine paperwork that constituted her official duties. Her desk was exactly as she had left it the previous evening before the weekend break. Neat stacks of supply requests organized according to priority and deadline. Her computer displaying the same spreadsheets and databases that occupied most of her working hours. The familiar environment provided a sense of normalcy that helped counteract the emotional intensity of the morning's events. But even as she tried to concentrate on inventory reports and procurement schedules, Ainsley could not entirely suppress the memories that her public revelation had brought to the surface. The scars on her back might have been hidden once again beneath her uniform, but the experiences that had created them remained as vivid and immediate as ever. The sound of the explosion that had changed her life forever still echoed in quiet moments. The faces of teammates who had not made it home continued to appear in her dreams with disturbing regularity. Her left side throbbed with renewed intensity, a physical manifestation of the day's emotional toll. She had taken the maximum allowed dose of over-the-counter pain medication, but it provided only marginal relief. The deeper ache, the one that lived in tissue that had been torn apart and imperfectly reassembled, required stronger pharmaceuticals that she tried to avoid during working hours because they affected her cognitive function. A soft knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Before she could respond, the door opened to reveal Colonel Marcus Harlow standing in the doorway. His earlier confidence and authority had been replaced by an expression of uncertainty and what appeared to be genuine contrition. He stood quietly for a moment as if gathering courage to begin a conversation that both of them knew would be difficult. "Corporal Thorne," he said finally, his voice lacking the commanding tone that had characterized their earlier interaction. "May I come in? I think we need to discuss what happened this morning." Ainsley gestured to the chair across from her desk, maintaining the same professional demeanor that she had displayed throughout their confrontation on the training field. Her expression revealed nothing of the complex emotions that Harlow's presence triggered. Anger would have been justified. Resentment would have been understandable. But what she felt was something closer to weary resignation, the tired acceptance of someone who had been through this pattern before and knew how it typically resolved. "Of course, sir. Please have a seat." Harlow closed the door behind him and settled into the offered chair. His movements betrayed the discomfort he felt with the situation. For several moments, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them as both considered how to address the morning's events and their implications. The office was small and utilitarian, decorated only with the standard military posters about safety protocols and equal opportunity policies. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in the flat, colorless illumination that characterized government buildings everywhere. "I owe you an apology," Harlow said slowly, his words coming carefully as if he was considering each one before speaking. "What I said this morning, the assumptions I made about you and your service, they were completely inappropriate and unfair. I had no right to question your request for a fitness exemption without understanding the circumstances behind it. I spoke from ignorance and arrogance, and I humiliated you in front of your peers. That was inexcusable." Ainsley listened to his apology without changing her expression, her hazel eyes fixed on his face as she evaluated his words and the sincerity behind them. She had heard apologies before, both genuine expressions of remorse and calculated attempts to minimize consequences. Years of experience had taught her to distinguish between the two, to recognize when someone was truly sorry versus when they were simply trying to protect themselves from repercussions. "I accept your apology, sir," she replied, her voice maintaining the same calm professionalism that had characterized all of their interactions. "But I think we both understand that the situation has moved beyond personal apologies. There are going to be questions about what happened this morning, and those questions will require answers that go beyond what either of us is comfortable discussing." Harlow nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in her statement. The morning's events had created a situation that would require intervention from higher authorities, people with the clearances and authorization necessary to determine how to handle a potential compromise of classified information. The weight of that reality settled over the small office like a physical presence. I have already spoken with my superiors, Harlow admitted, his voice dropping slightly as he broached the subject that both of them had been avoiding. There is going to be an investigation, not into your conduct, but into mine. They need to determine whether my actions this morning constituted a security breach and whether there were any violations of the protocols governing personnel with classified backgrounds. The admission carried weight that extended far beyond the simple statement of fact. Military investigations were serious affairs that could end careers and result in criminal charges if they uncovered evidence of willful misconduct or negligence. The fact that Harlow was facing such scrutiny demonstrated the gravity of what had occurred and the potential consequences that could flow from it. His career, built over 3 decades of service, now hung in the balance because of a few minutes of poor judgment on a cold October morning. I understand, sir, Ainsley responded, though her tone suggested that she was not entirely surprised by this development. I am prepared to cooperate with any investigation and to provide whatever information is required to clarify the circumstances. There is something else, Harlow continued, his discomfort with the conversation becoming more apparent. I have been informed that there may be changes to your current assignment. The people who manage personnel with your background are concerned that your cover may have been compromised, and they are evaluating whether it is still viable for you to remain in an administrative role here at Fort Carson. The possibility of reassignment was something that Ainsley had been expecting since the moment she had decided to reveal her scars. Special operations personnel who transitioned to administrative roles were provided with cover identities specifically to protect them from unwanted attention and to allow them to serve in conventional military positions without having to explain or justify their backgrounds. Once that cover was blown, as hers now clearly was, the individual often had to be moved to a different assignment where their true history could be better protected. I am prepared for whatever decision they make, Ainsley said, and Harlow could hear the truth in her words. She had clearly given considerable thought to the potential consequences of her actions and had accepted them as the price of ending a situation that had become untenable. The conversation was interrupted by another knock on the office door, followed immediately by the appearance of a man in civilian clothes who carried himself with the quiet authority that marked him as someone accustomed to dealing with sensitive situations. He was perhaps 45 years old, with graying hair and the kind of unremarkable appearance that suggested he worked in fields where blending in was more valuable than standing out. His eyes, however, were sharp and assessing, constantly evaluating and analyzing everything they observed. Corporal Thorne, Colonel Harlow, the man said, his voice carrying a slight regional accent that was difficult to place. I am Captain Derek Holloway from the Office of Special Investigations. I understand we need to discuss this morning's events. The arrival of an OSI agent confirmed what both Ainsley and Harlow had suspected. The morning's incident had attracted attention from the highest levels of the military security apparatus. The Office of Special Investigations was responsible for protecting classified information and investigating potential security breaches, and their involvement indicated that someone with significant authority was taking the situation very seriously. Captain Holloway, Harlow said, rising from his chair and extending his hand. I have been expecting someone from your office. Please have a seat. Holloway shook Harlow's hand briefly before turning his attention to Ainsley. His expression was professionally neutral, but his eyes held the kind of intensity that suggested he was constantly evaluating and analyzing everything he observed. He settled into the second chair in the small office, creating a triangle of attention that seemed to charge the air with tension. Corporal Thorne, I have read your file, both the official version and the classified annexes. I understand that this morning's incident was not entirely of your choosing. The statement was carefully worded, acknowledging the circumstances while avoiding any direct discussion of classified operations or sensitive information. It also suggested that Holloway had access to information about Ainsley's background that went far beyond what most people at Fort Carson would ever be authorized to know. That is correct, sir, Ainsley replied, her tone remaining professional despite the obvious tension in the room. I attempted to avoid the situation through conventional channels, but circumstances made that impossible. I have spoken with several witnesses to this morning's events. Holloway continued, settling more comfortably into his chair. Their accounts are remarkably consistent, which suggests that what occurred was witnessed by a significant number of personnel. That presents us with some challenges in terms of managing the information and protecting operational security. The agent's words carried implications that were clear to everyone in the room. When classified information was exposed to large numbers of people who lacked appropriate clearances, the situation became exponentially more complex. Each witness represented a potential security risk, someone who might inadvertently share information that could compromise ongoing operations or endanger personnel who were still serving in sensitive roles. The fact that nearly 200 soldiers had witnessed Ainsley's revelation meant that simple classification and suppression were no longer viable options. "What are our options?" Harlow asked, though his tone suggested that he already suspected the answer would not be encouraging. "Limited," Holloway replied bluntly. "The number of witnesses makes it impossible to simply classify the incident and move on. Too many people saw what happened, and attempting to suppress their discussions of the events would only attract more attention. We are going to have to manage this situation through damage control rather than prevention." Holloway turned his attention back to Ainsley, his expression becoming slightly more sympathetic, even as his voice maintained its professional tone. "Corporal Thorne, I am afraid that your current assignment is no longer viable. Your cover identity has been compromised beyond repair, and continuing to serve in an administrative role here would present ongoing security risks that we cannot accept. The question now is, what comes next for you?" The news was not unexpected, but hearing it stated so directly still carried emotional weight. Ainsley had grown comfortable with her routine at Fort Carson over the past 8 months. The work was unchallenging but predictable. The environment was stable. The demands were manageable given her physical limitations. The prospect of another major change in her life was daunting, even though she had been prepared for it intellectually. "What are my options?" she asked, echoing Harlow's earlier question. "Several," Holloway replied, consulting a folder that he had brought with him. "You can accept a medical retirement with full benefits, which would allow you to transition to civilian life with appropriate support for your ongoing medical needs. That is probably the simplest path forward and the one that most people in your situation choose." He paused, watching Ainsley's face for any reaction before continuing. "Alternatively, we have positions available in other locations where your background would be better protected and where your experience could be utilized more appropriately. There is a particular assignment that I have been authorized to offer you, one that would allow you to remain in military service while potentially making a significant contribution to future operations." The mention of a specific assignment caught both Ainsley's and Harlow's attention. The way Holloway phrased it suggested that this was not simply another administrative position in a different location, but something that had been specifically identified as suitable for someone with Ainsley's unique background and experience. "What kind of assignment?" Ainsley asked, her interest clearly piqued despite her attempts to maintain professional neutrality. Holloway leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone that suggested he was about to share information that went beyond routine personnel management. "Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The Special Operations Training Command needs instructors with real operational experience. They have specifically requested personnel who can provide students with insights that go beyond textbook knowledge and classroom theory. Your background, your experience, your understanding of what actually happens during high-risk operations, all of that would be invaluable to the next generation of special operations personnel." The offer hung in the air between them, representing a path forward that Ainsley had not fully considered. Teaching and mentoring would be entirely different from both combat operations and administrative work. It would require her to draw upon experiences that she had spent the past 18 months trying to process and integrate. It would mean confronting memories that still had the power to trigger intense emotional and physical reactions. But it would also provide a sense of purpose and meaning that administrative work had never offered. Before Ainsley could respond, Holloway continued with information that would transform her decision-making calculus entirely. "There is one additional factor you should know about. The next advanced tactical training cycle at Fort Bragg includes a student named Lieutenant Bryn Ashford. That name might not mean anything to you immediately, but Lieutenant Ashford's mother was Major Catherine Blackwood." The name hit Ainsley like a physical blow. Catherine Blackwood. Kate. The woman who had saved her life. The officer who had made the decision to create a diversion that allowed Ainsley to call in the airstrike that had accomplished the mission objective. The teammate whose body had been recovered from the blast site and interred at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors and a folded flag presented to next of kin at a funeral that Ainsley had been too injured to attend. Kate had a daughter. Ainsley's voice was barely above a whisper, the professional composure that she had maintained throughout the conversation finally cracking under the weight of this revelation. Lieutenant Ashford is 24 years old. Holloway confirmed, his voice gentle as he recognized the emotional impact of the information. She was in college when her mother was killed in action. The official notification indicated combat casualties with details classified. Lieutenant Ashford does not know the operational specifics of how her mother died. She does not know about Operation Steel Guardian. She does not know that her mother sacrificed herself to save a teammate and complete the mission. The implications cascaded through Ainsley's mind like dominoes falling in sequence. Kate's daughter existed. Kate's daughter had followed her mother into military service. Kate's daughter was training to become a special operations officer herself, preparing to walk the same dangerous path that had cost her mother everything. And Kate's daughter had no idea what had actually happened during those final moments in the mountains of Afghanistan. "I cannot face her." Ainsley said, the words emerging before she could stop them. "I am the reason Kate died. How can I possibly stand in front of her daughter and pretend to teach her anything?" Holloway's expression remained sympathetic but firm as he responded. "Or you honor Major Blackwood by ensuring that her daughter has every possible advantage, every piece of knowledge and experience that might help her survive what her mother did not. You can give Lieutenant Ashford the benefit of lessons learned through tragedy. You can make Kate's sacrifice mean something by preventing similar losses in the future." The logic was sound, but it did nothing to alleviate the weight of guilt that Ainsley carried. For 18 months, she had lived with the knowledge that Catherine Blackwood had died, creating a diversion that allowed Ainsley to coordinate the airstrike that had saved the team. The rational part of her mind understood that Kate had made a tactical decision, that the mission had required someone to draw enemy fire, that Ainsley had been too injured to perform that role herself. But rationality did little to quiet the voice that whispered in dark moments that she should have found another way, that she should have been the one to take that risk, that Kate had left behind a daughter who would now grow up without her mother. "I need time to think about this," Ainsley said finally, her voice regaining some of its professional steadiness, even as her mind continued to race through the implications of what she had just learned. "Of course," Holloway replied, standing to indicate that the meeting was concluding. "Take whatever time you need. This decision will affect the rest of your life, and it should not be made hastily. I will return tomorrow to discuss your decision and begin the necessary paperwork, regardless of which option you choose." After Holloway departed, Harlow remained in the office for a few additional moments. The weight of everything that had been discussed hung between them like a physical presence. Finally, he stood and moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the handle to offer one final observation. "For what it is worth, Corporal Thayern, I think you would make an excellent instructor. Not despite what you have been through, but because of it. Those students would be learning from someone who has paid the price for the lessons she teaches. That is worth more than any amount of classroom theory." After he left, Ainsley sat alone in her office as the afternoon light began to fade outside her window. The choice before her represented more than just a career decision. It was a question of how she would process the trauma she had survived, how she would honor the sacrifice that had saved her life, and whether she had the courage to face the daughter of the woman who had died protecting her. The scars on her back were hidden once again beneath her uniform, invisible to the casual observer. But in the quiet of her office, Ainsley was acutely aware of their presence, of the way damaged tissue pulled and ached with every movement, of the constant reminder that she carried pieces of that April morning in Afghanistan embedded in her body. Some of the shrapnel fragments had been too deep to remove safely, meaning that she would carry physical reminders of Operation Steel Guardian for the rest of her life. The evening approached as Ainsley finally left her office and walked across the base toward her small apartment in the junior enlisted housing area. The October air had grown colder with the setting sun, and frost was already beginning to form on surfaces that had warmed during the day. Soldiers moved around her, some heading to evening meals, others returning from late duties, all of them part of the massive organism that was a military installation in a constant operation. Several people stared as she passed, their expressions suggesting that they recognized her from the morning's incident. Word had spread far enough that her face was now associated with the story, even if most people did not know her name or the full details of what had transpired. Ainsley kept her eyes forward and maintained her steady pace, neither hurrying nor slowing in response to the attention. In her apartment, she prepared a simple meal that she barely tasted. The chronic pain in her side had intensified throughout the day, and she finally had allowed herself to take one of the stronger pain medications that her doctors had prescribed for severe episodes. The medication would help her sleep, which was important given the decision she needed to make. But it would also leave her slightly foggy in the morning, a trade-off that she had learned to accept when the pain became too intense to ignore. As she prepared for bed, Ainsley's thoughts kept returning to Kate Blackwood. The memories of their time serving together had taken on almost mythical qualities over the 18 months since Kate's death. In Ainsley's mind, Kate had become larger than life, a figure of perfect courage and unwavering competence. But she knew that Kate had been human, subject to the same fears and doubts that plagued everyone who served in combat roles. What had set Kate apart was not the absence of fear, but her ability to function despite it, to make hard decisions under pressure, and to prioritize the mission and her teammates above her own safety. Kate had talked occasionally about her daughter during quiet moments between operations. Brief mentions of a young woman studying at a university back home, pursuing a degree in international relations, planning a future that her mother hoped would not include military service. Kate had wanted something different for her daughter, something safer, a life that did not involve the constant risk and sacrifice that characterized special operations. The irony that Bryn had chosen to follow her mother's path, despite Kate's hopes for her future, was not lost on Ainsley. The decision crystallized as Ainsley drifted towards sleep, aided by medication and exhaustion. If Kate had wanted her daughter to have a different life, but Bryn had chosen this path anyway, then the best way to honor Kate's memory was to ensure that Bryn had every advantage possible. Ainsley could not bring Kate back. She could not undo the events of that April morning. But she could share the hard-won lessons that had cost Kate everything to teach. She could help prepare the next generation of operators to survive the situations that had claimed Kate's life. She could transform her survival and her guilt into something purposeful. The next morning, when Captain Holloway returned as promised, Ainsley was waiting with her decision already made. "I will accept the Fort Bragg assignment," she told him without preamble. "When do I report?" Holloway smiled slightly, the first expression of approval she had seen from the normally reserved investigator. "I will have orders cut immediately. You can report within 2 weeks, which will give you time to out-process from Fort Carson and prepare for the transition. The training cycle begins in 3 weeks, so you will have a few days to get oriented before the students arrive." As Holloway began the process of finalizing her reassignment, Ainsley felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The decision was made. The path forward was clear. She would face Kate's daughter. She would share what she had learned. She would try to prevent other families from receiving folded flags and sanitized casualty reports. It would not be easy. It might not even be possible. But it was what Kate would have wanted, and that made it the only choice Ainsley could live with. The story of the fitness assessment incident continued to spread in the days that followed, taking on new details and interpretations with each retelling. But Ainsley was no longer at Fort Carson to witness the evolution of her legend. Her out-processing was expedited, her departure quiet and unremarked. By the time most people realized she was gone, she was already on her way to North Carolina and a future she could not fully imagine. As Colorado disappeared in her rearview mirror, Ainsley allowed herself one final glance at the mountains that had witnessed her breaking point. The scars on her back had forced her out of hiding. Now they would carry her forward into purpose. She turned her eyes east toward North Carolina, toward Kate's daughter, toward whatever redemption might look like for someone who survived when others did not. The road stretched ahead, empty and full of possibility in equal measure. Fort Bragg sprawled across more than 160,000 acres of North Carolina landscape, a military installation so vast that it functioned almost as a small city unto itself. The base served as home to multiple special operations units, airborne divisions, and specialized training commands that prepared soldiers for the most demanding missions the military could conceive. The scale and complexity of the installation reflected the importance that the armed forces placed on maintaining elite capabilities, on ensuring that America's most challenging operations were conducted by personnel who had been trained to standards that exceeded anything found in conventional units. Ainsley Thorne arrived on a gray November morning when fog still clung to the ground and moisture hung in the air with the weight of impending rain. The drive from Colorado had taken 3 days, giving her time to process the magnitude of the change she was undertaking and to prepare herself mentally for what lay ahead. The landscape had transformed gradually as she traveled east, the arid mountains of Colorado giving way to plains and then to the green hills and pine forests of the Carolinas. Each mile had carried her further from the comfortable anonymity she had maintained at Fort Carson and closer to a future that involved confronting memories she had spent 18 months trying to integrate. The Special Operations Training Command occupied a dedicated section of Fort Bragg, separated from other units by both physical distance and security protocols that limited access to authorized personnel only. The buildings were modern but utilitarian, designed for function rather than appearance. Training facilities included everything from classrooms equipped with the latest simulation technology to live fire ranges and mock urban environments where students could practice tactics under realistic conditions. Ainsley reported to the headquarters building where she was greeted by Colonel Lisa Drummond, the officer commanding the training command. Drummond was 50 years old with silver threading through her dark hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of service in demanding environments. Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct and assessing in the way of someone accustomed to evaluating personnel quickly and accurately. Corporal Thorne, welcome to Fort Bragg. I have read your file, both the official version and the classified sections. Your operational experience is exactly what we need here. These students will face situations that no amount of classroom instruction can fully prepare them for. Having instructors who have actually been there, who have made the hard calls under fire that makes all the difference. The words were welcoming, but Ainsley detected an undercurrent of assessment in Drummond's tone. The colonel was evaluating her, determining whether the person who had survived Operation Steel Guardian would be able to translate that experience into effective instruction. It was a fair question, one that Ainsley herself was not entirely certain she could answer positively. Thank you, ma'am. I will do my best to ensure these students are as prepared as possible for what they will face. Drummond led Ainsley through the facility, pointing out classrooms, briefing rooms, and training areas that would become familiar over the coming months. The tour concluded in a small office that would serve as Ainsley's workspace when she was not actively instructing. The space was modest but functional, with a desk, computer, filing cabinets, and a window that looked out over one of the training ranges. The advanced tactical course begins in 1 week, Drummond explained as they settled into chairs in the office. You will have 18 students, all of them already qualified in basic special operations skills. Your job is to take them to the next level, to teach them the kind of tactical decision-making and coordination that can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The curriculum covers everything from close air support coordination to multi-team operations in complex environments. Ainsley listened carefully, making mental notes about the scope and expectations of her new role. The curriculum Drummond described was comprehensive, covering exactly the kinds of skills that had been tested during Operation Steel Guardian. Skills that Ainsley had demonstrated under the most extreme conditions, imaginable though, at a cost that still haunted her quiet moments. There is one student I want to mention specifically. Drummond continued, her tone becoming slightly more cautious. Lieutenant Bryn Ashford. Her file shows exceptional aptitude and strong motivation. She also lost her mother in combat operations about 18 months ago. The details are classified, so she does not know the full circumstances. I wanted you to be aware of her situation in case it becomes relevant to her training. The mention of Bryn's name sent a jolt through Ainsley's system, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. She had known this moment was coming, had spent the entire drive from Colorado preparing herself for it, but the reality of actually being in the same facility as Kate Blackwood's daughter created an emotional response that intellectual preparation could not fully mitigate. I understand, ma'am. I will ensure that Lieutenant Ashford receives the same quality of instruction as every other student. I never doubted that, Drummond replied, standing to indicate that the orientation was concluding. Take the rest of the week to familiarize yourself with the curriculum and facilities. The students report Monday morning at 0700 for initial formation. Any questions? No, ma'am? Thank you. After Drummond departed, Ainsley sat alone in her new office, staring out the window at the training range beyond. The fog had begun to lift, revealing targets and obstacles that students would navigate countless times over the coming weeks. The reality of what she had committed to was settling over her with increasing weight. In 1 week, she would stand in front of a classroom that included Kate Blackwood's daughter. She would look into the face of a young woman who bore her mother's features and probably her determination. She would have to teach without revealing the connection that bound them through tragedy and sacrifice. The week passed in a blur of curriculum review and facility familiarization. Ainsley spent hours studying lesson plans, refreshing her knowledge of tactical procedures, and preparing materials for the instruction she would provide. The work was consuming, which was exactly what she needed. It left little time for the doubts and fears that threatened to surface whenever her mind was not fully occupied. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. Ainsley stood at the front of a classroom at 0645, watching through the window as students began to arrive. They came individually and in small groups, most of them young lieutenants and senior NCOs who had already distinguished themselves in conventional units and were now seeking qualification for special operations roles. Their movements were confident, their bearing professional, but Ainsley could see the nervous energy that came with beginning a training program that would test them in ways they could not yet fully imagine. At 0655, a young woman entered the classroom, and Ainsley felt her breath catch in her throat. Lieutenant Bryn Ashford was 24 years old with her mother's dark hair and strong features. She carried herself with the same combination of confidence and intensity that Kate had displayed, a sense of purpose that was evident in every movement. She took a seat near the front of the classroom, her eyes already scanning the materials that had been placed on each desk, absorbing information with the kind of focused attention that marks serious students. At precisely 0700, Ainsley called the class to attention. 18 students rose as one, their responses crisp and immediate. She had them take their seats and spent the next few minutes conducting administrative matters, confirming that everyone was present and accounted for, ensuring that all had received the necessary materials. Then she turned to the primary purpose of the morning, introducing herself and establishing expectations for the course. Good morning, I am Corporal Ainsley Thorne and I will be your primary instructor for advanced tactical operations. My background is in communications and coordination with experience in multi-team operations in complex environments. Over the next 10 weeks, we will cover everything from close air support coordination to decision-making under pressure to the kind of tactical flexibility that real-world operations demand. She paused, noting the students' reactions. Several were taking notes. Others watched her with expressions that ranged from interested to slightly skeptical. She was aware that her appearance, her small stature, and relatively low rank might create doubts about her qualifications to teach at this level. That was fine. She had learned long ago that proving herself through action was more effective than attempting to establish credibility through words alone. Some of you may be wondering about my qualifications to teach this material. Ainsley continued, addressing the unspoken question directly. That is fair. I am not going to stand here and recite a resume or list operations I have participated in. Most of that information is classified anyway. What I will tell you is this. Everything I teach you comes from experience, not from textbooks. The lessons you learn in this course have been paid for in ways I hope you never have to experience personally. My job is to give you the knowledge and skills that might prevent you from learning these lessons the hard way. When the statement hung in the air for a moment, creating a subtle shift in the classroom atmosphere. The skepticism in several students' expressions transformed into something closer to curiosity. They were beginning to understand that there was more to their instructor than her appearance suggested. In the front row, Bryn Ashford leaned forward slightly, her attention intensifying. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the classroom. Ma'am, can I ask about your operational background? You mentioned communications and coordination. Have you worked in actual combat environments or primarily in training and simulation contexts? The question was respectfully phrased, but pointed the kind of inquiry that sought to establish whether the instructor possessed practical experience or merely theoretical knowledge. It was exactly the kind of question that Kate Blackwood would have asked in similar circumstances, the product of a mind that valued demonstrated competence over claimed expertise. Ainsley met Bryn's gaze directly, seeing so much of Kate in the young woman's eyes that it created an almost physical ache in her chest. But she kept her voice steady and professional as she responded. I have worked in actual combat environments, Lieutenant Ashford. Multiple deployments, multiple operations in conditions that tested every skill I possessed. The specifics are classified, but I can assure you that the lessons I will teach you come from practical experience, not simulation. Thank you, ma'am, Bryn replied, apparently satisfied with the answer. But her eyes remained focused on Ainsley with an intensity that suggested she was still evaluating, still assessing whether this small woman with the quiet voice truly had the experience to prepare them for what lay ahead. The first week of instruction focused on classroom work covering theoretical foundations and procedural details that would underpin the practical exercises to come. Ainsley taught with careful precision, breaking down complex tactical concepts into components that students could understand and internalize. She used examples drawn from actual operations, though carefully sanitized to avoid revealing classified information. The students responded well, their initial skepticism gradually giving way to recognition that their instructor possessed deep knowledge of the subject matter. But it was Bryn who consistently pushed hardest, who asked the most challenging questions, who seemed determined to extract every possible piece of knowledge from the instruction. After each class, she would approach Ainsley with additional questions, seeking clarification on specific scenarios or requesting more detailed explanations of tactical principles. The interactions were professional and appropriate, but they created a growing connection that Ainsley found both meaningful and painful. During the second week, the training shifted to practical exercises. The first major event was a live-fire coordination drill where students would practice calling in simulated air support on designated targets. The scenario was designed to test their ability to calculate coordinates, communicate effectively under pressure, and make rapid decisions about when to authorize strikes that would be danger close to friendly positions. The students deployed to the training range in teams of 3, each team responsible for a specific sector. Ainsley observed from the control tower, monitoring radio communications and evaluating how each team handled the pressure and complexity of the scenario. Most performed adequately, demonstrating basic competence in the required skills. A few excelled, showing the kind of natural aptitude that marked potential for advanced roles. Bryn's team was the last to execute their scenario. Ainsley watched as they moved into position, establishing communications and beginning their assessment of the tactical situation. Everything proceeded normally until the scenario controllers introduced a complication, simulated enemy forces moving rapidly toward friendly positions, requiring immediate air support to prevent being overrun. Bryn, as team leader, was responsible for making the call. Through her headset, Ainsley could hear Bryn's breathing become more rapid as she calculated distances and assessed options. The scenario was designed to create pressure to force students to make decisions quickly with incomplete information. Most previous teams had called in the strike without excessive hesitation, accepting the risk inherent in danger-close support. But Bryn was frozen, her calculations becoming increasingly frantic as she tried to find a solution that eliminated all risk to friendly forces. "Lieutenant Ashford," Ainsley's voice came through the radio net, calm and steady. "Report your status." "Ma'am, I am calculating distances. The enemy force is within 70 meters of friendly positions. Standard danger close protocols recommend 100 meters minimum separation. I am trying to find an alternative approach." "There is no alternative approach, Lieutenant. The scenario does not allow for it. You need to make a decision now." "But ma'am, the risk to friendly forces is significant." "Yes, that is the nature of danger close support. Sometimes the only way to save lives is to accept risk. Sometimes the choice is between a certain bad outcome and a possible worse outcome. What is your decision?" The radio went silent for several long seconds. Ainsley could almost feel Bryn's internal struggle, the conflict between her desire to find a perfect solution and the tactical reality that no such solution existed. It was a moment that every operator faced, eventually the realization that combat did not offer clean choices, only hard ones. Finally, Bryn's voice returned steadier, now in carrying the weight of decision. "Control, this is Team 3, requesting immediate air support on designated coordinates. Acknowledge danger close situation. Friendly forces are advised to take cover. Team 3 control. Strike authorized. Execute." The simulated airstrike proceeded without incident, the scenario concluding successfully with enemy forces neutralized and friendly casualties avoided through Bryn's decision to accept calculated risk. But when the team returned to the debriefing area, Bryn's face showed the emotional toll that the exercise had taken. Her hands were shaking slightly, and her jaw was set with the kind of tension that suggested she was fighting to maintain composure. Ainsley conducted the debriefing with the same professional demeanor she brought to all interactions, praising what the team had done well and identifying areas for improvement. But after the other students departed, she asked Bryn to remain for additional discussion. Lieutenant Ashford talked to me about what you were feeling during that scenario. Bryn was silent for a moment, clearly struggling with whether to be honest about her internal experience or to maintain the kind of professional distance that military culture often encouraged. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but intense. I was terrified, ma'am. Not of the enemy or the tactical situation. I was terrified of making the wrong call, of being responsible for friendly casualties because I authorized a strike that was too close. I kept thinking about my mother, about how she died in a classified operation. I do not know the details, but I know it involved combat. I kept wondering if someone had to make a call like that, if someone had to accept risk that resulted in her death. The words hit Ainsley like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy on the guilt she carried. Bryn was wrestling with exactly the kind of decision that Ainsley had faced in the mountains of Afghanistan, the kind of call that had resulted in Kate Blackwood's death. The irony of teaching Kate's daughter how to make those decisions, of preparing her to potentially face similar situations, was almost unbearable. Your mother died honorably, Lieutenant, Ainsley said, choosing her words with extreme care. I can tell you that much, even without knowing the classified details. She died doing what she believed was necessary, making the choices that military service sometimes demands. The fear you felt during that scenario, the weight of responsibility that is appropriate and healthy, the day you stop feeling the gravity of those decisions is the day you should stop making them. How do you handle it, ma'am? How do you live with the calls you have made, and especially if they resulted in casualties? The question was so direct, so painfully relevant to Ainsley's own experience, that for a moment she could not formulate a response. How did she handle it? The honest answer was that she did not handle it well, that she carried Kate's death with her every day, that survivor's guilt was a constant companion that no amount of therapy or rationalization could fully eliminate. But that was not what Bryn needed to hear. What Bryn needed was guidance on how to function despite the weight, how to continue serving even when the cost became almost unbearable. You accept that some experiences change you, Ainsley said finally. You cannot go through significant decisions, especially ones that involve life and death, and remain exactly the same person you were before. The goal is not to be unchanged. The goal is to integrate those experiences in ways that make you wiser and more effective, rather than allowing them to diminish your capacity for future service. You honor the people who were affected by your decisions by ensuring that their sacrifice, if there was one, meant something. Bryn nodded slowly, processing the words. Her hands had stopped shaking, and some of the tension had left her posture. She seemed to be drawing strength from the conversation, from the sense that her instructor understood the weight she was carrying, even if the specific details differed. Thank you, ma'am. That helps. Over the following weeks, the training intensified. Students moved through increasingly complex scenarios that tested not just their technical skills, but their judgment, their ability to function under pressure, and their capacity to make hard decisions with incomplete information. Ainsley pushed them relentlessly, creating training environments that were as realistic as safety protocols allowed. She was demanding but fair, providing detailed feedback and guidance that helped students understand not just what they had done wrong, but why and how to improve. Bryn emerged as one of the strongest students in the class. Her initial hesitation gave way to growing confidence as she accumulated successful training iterations and developed trust in her own judgment. Ainsley watched the transformation with a mixture of pride and pain, seeing so much of Kate in the way Bryn approached problems and led her teams. The connection between them grew stronger as the weeks progressed, built on mutual respect and the kind of trust that developed between instructor and student when both took the work seriously. But the connection also created complications. There were moments when Bryn would make a gesture or use a phrase that was so reminiscent of Kate that Ainsley would have to pause and collect herself. There were training scenarios that too closely paralleled the situation in Afghanistan, triggering flashbacks and PTSD symptoms that Ainsley had to manage while maintaining her professional composure. The chronic pain in her side worsened under the stress, requiring her to rely more heavily on medication than she preferred. The breaking point came during the 8th week of training. The students were conducting a complex live fire exercise that required coordinating multiple teams across a large training area. The scenario included simulated enemy forces, civilian complications, and the requirement to call in close air support at a critical juncture. Bryn was serving as the overall mission commander, responsible for coordinating all elements and making final decisions about when and where to employ supporting fires. The exercise was proceeding well until an unexpected equipment malfunction created a situation where real ammunition was mixed with training rounds in one sector. The safety protocols immediately halted the exercise, but not before two students were pinned down by what they believed were simulated rounds, but which included live fire. The situation was not immediately life-threatening because the students had taken cover, but they were trapped and increasingly panicked as they realized something was wrong. Ainsley was observing from the control tower when the situation developed. She heard the fear in the students' voices over the radio net, heard the confusion as they tried to understand why the training scenario had taken such an unexpected turn. She saw Bryn freezing at the command post, overwhelmed by a situation that had escalated beyond anything the training had prepared her for. And she felt her own PTSD triggered with overwhelming intensity as the sounds and chaos combined to transport her back to that April morning in Afghanistan. For a moment, Ainsley was no longer at Fort Bragg. She was back in the mountains, hearing the explosion, feeling the shrapnel tear through her back, watching Kate charge toward the enemy position. The past and present merged into a single moment of terror and helplessness that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Her vision narrowed, her breathing became rapid and shallow, and the chronic pain in her side flared to levels that made movement difficult. But somewhere beneath the panic and the flashback, beneath the trauma response that was trying to shut her down, was the training and discipline that had kept her functional through the actual event in Afghanistan. That part of her recognized that students were in danger, that Bryn was frozen, that someone needed to take control of the situation immediately. With an effort of will that felt like lifting an impossible weight, Ainsley forced herself to move. She left the control tower at a run, ignoring the pain that screamed through her side with every step. She reached the training area where students were pinned down and assessed the situation with the kind of tactical clarity that came from having actually lived through similar circumstances. She identified safe routes of approach, calculated angles of fire, and formulated a plan to extract the trapped students without exposing herself or others to unnecessary risk. "Everyone hold position," she ordered over the radio net, her voice cutting through the confusion with absolute authority. "Cease all fire immediately. I am moving to extract the pinned personnel." What followed was a demonstration of exactly the kind of tactical competence that veterans of special operations develop through hard experience. Ainsley moved through the training area with precision and speed, using terrain and cover with practiced efficiency that could only come from real combat. She reached the pinned students, assessed their condition, and coordinated their extraction while maintaining constant awareness of the broader tactical situation. Every movement was textbook perfect, every decision exactly what should have been made under the circumstances. Bryn watched from the command post, her earlier paralysis giving way to awe as she witnessed her instructor function in a crisis situation with a level of competence that transcended anything that could be taught in a classroom. This was not simulation or theory. This was someone who had done this before, who had moved under actual fire and made life or death decisions in real time. The realization transformed Bryn's understanding of who her instructor actually was and what she had survived to be standing here teaching them. After the situation was resolved and the students were confirmed safe, Ainsley finally allowed herself to acknowledge the physical and emotional toll. She made it back to her office before the combination of pain, exhaustion, and delayed reaction to the PTSD trigger overwhelmed her defenses. She collapsed into her chair, hands shaking and breath coming in gasps as her body processed what had just occurred. She did not hear the door open or notice Bryn's presence until the young woman spoke. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Ainsley looked up to see Bryn standing in the doorway, her expression showing concern mixed with something else. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. The kind of look that suggested Bryn had just seen past the carefully maintained professional facade to glimpse the reality underneath. "I am fine, Lieutenant. Just needed a moment to catch my breath." "You have done that before. What you just did out there, that was not textbook knowledge. That was muscle memory from actual experience. You have been under real fire, made real extractions. You are not just an instructor with a combat experience. You are a combat veteran with instructor duties. The distinction Bryn drew was subtle but significant. It reflected a deeper understanding of what Ainsley had survived and what those experiences meant. Ainsley could have deflected the observation, could have maintained the professional distance that military culture often encouraged. But looking at Bryn, seeing Kate's daughter standing before her with that same intense focus and determination to understand, she found she could not maintain the fiction any longer. Yes, Lieutenant, I have been there. I have made the calls you are training to make. I have experienced the consequences of those decisions in ways that I hope you never have to personally endure. The scars, Bryn said quietly, the pieces clearly clicking into place in her mind. There was an incident at Fort Carson about a month ago. I heard about it through the informal network. An instructor who had been forced to reveal combat injuries during a fitness assessment. That was you, was it not? Ainsley nodded slowly, recognizing that further denial would be pointless and perhaps counterproductive. That was me. My cover identity was compromised. This assignment was the result. Bryn moved fully into the office and closed the door behind her. When she spoke again, her voice carried an intensity that suggested she was working toward a question that mattered deeply to her. Ma'am, I need to ask you something. My mother died 18 months ago in a classified operation. The official notification said combat casualties with details classified for operational security. I have spent every day since then wondering what actually happened, how she died, whether she suffered, whether her death meant anything. You have the kind of experience that suggests you might have access to information about classified operations. Is there any way you could help me understand what happened to her? The question hung in the air between them, creating a moment that felt suspended outside normal time. Ainsley looked at Kate Blackwood's daughter and saw the need for answers written plainly across her face. She understood that need understood the way uncertainty could be worse than painful truth, understood that Bryn deserved to know how her mother had died. But she also understood that revealing classified information violated regulations and oaths, that some secrets were protected for reasons that transcended individual needs. Lieutenant Ashford, Ainsley said slowly, choosing each word with extreme care. What if I told you that I cannot discuss classified operations, but that I can tell you with absolute certainty that your mother died honorably, courageously, and in a manner that saved lives and accomplished objectives that mattered? What if I told you that her sacrifice was not meaningless, that people survived because of decisions she made, that her death embodied everything that military service aspires to represent? Bryn's eyes widened as the implications of Ainsley's words registered. The careful phrasing, the specific knowledge, the depth of certainty in the statement, all of it pointed toward a conclusion that transformed everything. You were there, Bryn whispered. You were with my mother when she died. You know exactly what happened. Ainsley felt tears beginning to form in her eyes for the first time since arriving at Fort Bragg. The weight of 18 months of carrying this secret of living with guilt and survivor's remorse suddenly became too much to bear in silence. Yes, I was there. Operation Steel Guardian, April 2023, Helmand Province. Your mother was my team leader. She saved my life. She died creating a diversion that allowed me to coordinate the airstrike that completed our mission. I am alive because Catherine Blackwood chose to protect her teammate instead of protecting herself. The words came out in a rush, breaking through the dam of professional discretion and operational security that had kept them contained for so long. Bryn stood frozen, her face cycling through shock, grief, and something that might have been relief at finally having answers to questions that had haunted her for 18 months. Tell me everything, Bryn said, her voice shaking but determined. Please, I need to know what happened to her. And so Ainsley told the story. Not the sanitized version from official reports. Not the carefully edited account designed to protect classified sources and methods. The real story. The ambush. The IED that had torn through Ainsley's back. Kate dragging her to cover despite withering enemy fire. The desperate fight as their position became increasingly untenable. Kate's decision to create a diversion by drawing enemy fire toward herself. Ainsley calling in the airstrike with Kate in the blast radius because there was no other option that would save the rest of the team. Kate's body recovered from the site. Ainsley extracted unconscious and bleeding. Bryn listened without interrupting, tears streaming down her face as she finally learned the truth about her mother's final moments. When Ainsley finished, silence filled the office for a long moment, broken only by the sound of both women trying to control their breathing. She talked about me. Bryn finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. In those final moments. Yes, she told me to tell you that she died for something that mattered. She said you needed to know that she chose this, that she would choose it again. She said she was proud of you and that her only regret was not being there to see what you would become. The words broke something in Bryn, and she began to sob openly, the kind of deep, wrenching grief that comes when loss is finally given voice and validation. Ainsley moved around her desk and pulled Bryn into an embrace, holding Kate's daughter the way Kate had once held her during a difficult moment on a previous deployment. They stood together in the small office, two women connected by tragedy and sacrifice, both crying for a woman who had given everything and asked nothing in return. Eventually, the tears subsided and they separated. Bryn wiped her eyes and took several deep breaths, visibly composing herself. When she spoke, her voice was steady, despite the emotional storm that had just passed through her. Teach me everything she would have taught me. Everything you learned from her, every skill, every lesson, every piece of wisdom. Help me become the kind of operator she was. That is how I want to honor her memory. That is exactly what I am here to do, Ainsley replied. Your mother was the best operator I ever served with. If I can give you even a fraction of what she gave me, you will be extraordinary. The remaining weeks of the training course took on new meaning for both of them. Ainsley pushed Bryn harder than any other student, demanding excellence and accepting nothing less than complete commitment. Bryn rose to meet every challenge, driven by the desire to honor her mother's legacy and to prove herself worthy of the sacrifice that had been made. The other students noticed the intensity of the relationship between instructor and student, but they attributed it to professional respect rather than understanding the deeper connection that bound them. Graduation day arrived in mid-January with clear skies and temperatures that felt almost warm after the cold of the previous months. All 18 students had successfully completed the course, demonstrating the skills and judgment necessary to operate at advanced levels. But it was Bryn who received the distinguished honor graduate recognition, her performance throughout the course having exceeded every standard and expectation. At the graduation ceremony, Bryn gave a speech that she had written without Ainsley's knowledge. She spoke about courage and sacrifice, about the legacy of those who had come before, about the responsibility that came with following in the footsteps of warriors who had paid the ultimate price. She spoke about her mother, about Major Catherine Blackwood, who had died in service to her country and her teammates. And she spoke about the importance of learning from those who had survived, of honoring the fallen, by ensuring that their lessons were not lost. My instructor taught me that scars do not make you weak, Bryn said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled personnel. They prove you survived something that should have destroyed you. Corporal Thorne carries scars that speak to experiences most of us cannot imagine, but she has transformed that trauma into wisdom, that survival into purpose. She has given us the benefit of lessons that were paid for at a price none of us should have to pay ourselves. That is the definition of honor. That is what service means. The standing ovation that followed was genuine and sustained. Ainsley stood at the side of the stage, tears running freely down her face, finally allowing herself to feel something other than guilt about having survived Operation Steel Guardian. Kate's sacrifice had meaning because her daughter would carry forward the lessons. The pain and trauma that Ainsley had endured had purpose because she could prevent others from experiencing similar losses. The scars that had defined her for 18 months were no longer just reminders of failure to protect her team leader. They were evidence of survival and resilience and the possibility of finding meaning even in the darkest experiences. After the ceremony, as families and friends congratulated the graduates, Bryn approached Ainsley with a small box in her hands. I want you to have this, Bryn said, her voice thick with emotion. She opened the box with trembling hands to reveal a Bronze Star medal, the brass still bright despite the years. This was my mother's. She earned it for actions during a deployment to Iraq in 2018, before I knew what she really did for a living. Bryn's fingers traced the edge of the medal, and Ainsley saw tears forming in the young woman's eyes. For years, this was all I had of her real service. The only proof that she was more than what the sanitized stories suggested. Now I know the truth. I know she died saving you. I know you're standing here because she chose to draw that fire. She closed Ainsley's hands around the box. I want you to keep it. Not because you need validation or recognition, but because you're carrying her forward. Every student you teach, every life you save through preparation, that's her legacy continuing. You were her teammate. You carry her lessons. That makes you family. Ainsley's vision blurred as she looked down at the medal. The weight of it was more than brass and ribbon. It was trust, forgiveness, recognition that survival was not betrayal. Her hands shook as she opened the box again, reading the citation Kate had earned 5 years before her death. "I will treasure this," Ainsley whispered. "And I promise you, but promise Kate that I will continue this work until I cannot stand anymore. Your mother saved me for a reason. This is that reason." "I know," Bryn replied. "That is why I am not worried about deploying. I have been taught by the best by someone who learned from my mother and who carries those lessons in ways that transcend any manual or doctrine. Whatever I face out there, I will face it with the knowledge and skills that two of the bravest women I know have given me." Colonel Marcus Harlow received his new orders 3 weeks after Ainsley departed Fort Carson. Reassignment to Logistics Command at Fort Hood, a position far from combat training and public view. The reprimand in his file would follow him for the remainder of his career, a permanent reminder that assumptions could destroy more than just reputations. He never contacted Ainsley again. But 6 months later, a letter arrived at Fort Bragg addressed simply to Corporal Thorne's Special Operations Training Demand. Inside was a single handwritten page. "I have spent 30 years believing I understood what makes a soldier. You taught me in 30 seconds that I understood nothing. Thank you for the lesson, even though it cost me everything I built. Those students are lucky to have you." M.A.T. Ainsley folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. Forgiveness took many forms. Sometimes it looked like this. 6 months later, Ainsley stood in the same office where she had first told Bryn the truth about Kate's death. The space had become familiar and now filled with materials and memories removed from multiple training cycles. She had taught 3 more courses since Bryn's graduation, each one benefiting from the lessons she continued to refine and develop. The chronic pain in her side remained a constant companion, but she had learned to manage it better, to accept it as part of her reality, rather than fighting against it constantly. On her desk was a framed photograph that had not been there before. It showed 3 women in uniform, Kate Blackwood in the center, young Bryn on one side during a family visit to a military base years earlier, and Ainsley on the other side during a team photo ball from before Operation Steel Guardian. The image had been carefully composed from 2 separate photographs, bringing together 3 lives connected by service and sacrifice and love. A letter from Bryn sat beside the photograph, its pages worn from multiple readings. The letter described her first month with her operational unit, the challenges and successes, the ways that the training had prepared her for real-world missions. But mostly it described gratitude for the truth about her mother, for the instruction that had prepared her to follow in Kate's footsteps, for the connection that transcended professional relationships and had become something deeper and more meaningful. Ainsley picked up the letter and read it again, allowing herself to feel pride in what she had accomplished. The scars on her back would always be there, permanent reminders of April 20 and everything that had been lost that day. But they had become something more than marks of trauma. They were proof of survival. They were credentials that qualified her to teach lessons that mattered. They were evidence that even the worst experiences could be transformed into purpose if you had the courage to face them and the determination to find meaning in suffering. The next training cycle would begin in 2 weeks. 18 new students would arrive, each bringing their own motivations and capabilities, each needing to be pushed and challenged and prepared for missions that could not be fully anticipated. Ainsley would teach them with the same intensity and commitment that she had brought to every previous class. She would draw on her experiences, painful as they were, to provide insights that could save lives and accomplish objectives. She would honor Kate Blackwood's memory by ensuring that the next generation of operators learned from her sacrifice. This was where Ainsley Thorne belonged, not behind a desk at Fort Carson hiding from her past and pretending that her service had followed conventional paths. Here at Fort Bragg, teaching the warriors who would face tomorrow's challenges. The scars on her back had led her to this place, to this purpose, to this mission that gave meaning to everything she had survived. And she would continue this work for as long as the military would allow her to serve, for as long as her body and mind could handle the demands, for as long as there were students who needed to learn the lessons that had been written in blood and pain and sacrifice on a mountainside in Afghanistan. The scars would always speak, but now finally they spoke of more than loss. They spoke of resilience and purpose and the possibility of redemption through service. And that was enough.